A black man named Darius Grant finds himself unjustly detained by two prejudiced officers, Murphy and Bates. However, as Darius's true identity comes to light, it shocks everyone in the police station. What unfolded, and who exactly is Darius Grant, that led the entire station to realize they were not just dealing with a simple legal matter, but rather facing a profound moment of reckoning? Let's dive into the story. But first, share where you're watching from today in the comments. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit subscribe. It was an ordinary morning in the city center. The first rays of sun were just peeking over the tall buildings, casting shadows on the busy streets below. The air buzzed with car horns, distant sirens, and the hum of people talking. Folks were starting their day, hustling to work, grabbing their coffee, or taking their dogs for a walk. The neighborhood was lively and full of energy. In the midst of it all, Darius Grant moved calmly, in stark contrast to the fast pace around him. Darius, in his mid-30s, was dressed sharply in a tailored suit. His polished shoes clicked as he strolled, a relaxed smile on his face as he adjusted the cuffs on his crisp white shirt. He didn't draw attention because he tried to. It was the quiet confidence he carried. People couldn't help but notice him. He'd just finished breakfast at a nearby diner he often visited. The staff there knew him by name and always got his order just right. Scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and a side of fruit. He headed toward his sleek black sedan, parked along the street. Just then, he felt his phone buzz in his pocket. Taking it out, he saw a text from his mom, reminding him of their dinner plans that night. Smiling, he quickly typed a response, letting her know he hadn't forgotten. Family meant everything to him. As he was about to unlock his car, he noticed two police officers coming his way, their eyes fixed on him with unreadable expressions. Darius didn't recognize them. New officers were always coming through the area, but their intense stares made him wary. Darius had been taught from a young age how to handle himself around police, especially as a black man. His dad had always reminded him to stay calm, be respectful, and never give them a reason to escalate a situation. Those lessons were ingrained in him. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out as they approached. Darius stopped and turned, holding his phone in one hand. "Yes, officer," Darius answered, his voice steady and polite. He noticed the officer's name tag read Murphy. The other officer, Bates, stood slightly back, with his hand resting on his belt near his holster. "Can I see some ID?" Murphy asked, his tone sharp and demanding. No greeting. No reason for the stop. Just a demand. Darius had been through this before, but something felt off this time. There was tension in the air that put him on edge. "May I ask why?" Darius replied, keeping his voice calm. He didn't want to provoke them, but he also knew his rights. He hadn't done anything wrong, so there was no reason for them to ask for his ID. Murphy's eyes narrowed, and a smirk crept onto his face. "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." Darius met the officer's gaze for a beat, then slowly reached into his jacket pocket. "All right," he said, pulling out his wallet, "but I'd still like to know why I'm being asked for it." As he handed Murphy his driver's license, he noticed Bates shift slightly as if getting ready for something. Darius's senses were on high alert, but he remained composed. Murphy examined the ID, expressionless. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Murphy asked, his tone accusatory. Darius raised an eyebrow in confusion. "I'm just heading to my car," he replied honestly. "Is there a problem?" Murphy ignored the question. "Where are you coming from?" "I had breakfast at the diner down the street," Darius responded. "Like I said, is there a problem, officer?" Murphy's eyes darted back up to Darius's, with a flicker of something, annoyance maybe, before he handed the ID back. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area," Murphy said with a smirk. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." Darius's stomach tightened. He'd heard this before. A black man in a nice area, dressed well. Must be up to something, right? Even though he was used to it, it didn't make it any easier to deal with. "I see," Darius said carefully. "Well, I'm sure this is a misunderstanding. I'm just here to get to my car and head to work." Murphy wasn't listening. He stepped closer, his stance turning aggressive. "What kind of work do you do?" "I'm a lawyer," Darius replied, keeping his tone steady. "I have a meeting in an hour, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way." That seemed to throw Murphy off. His smirk faded for just a moment. "A lawyer, huh? You don't say." Bates, who hadn't said a word so far, finally spoke up. "You sure you're not hiding anything? Got anything illegal in that car of yours?" Darius could feel the tension escalating. He knew how quickly these situations could spiral out of control. He had to stay calm and diffuse it. "There's nothing illegal in my car, officer," he said. "You're welcome to check, but I'd prefer if you didn't waste your time. I'm just trying to get to work." Murphy's face hardened. "You don't get to decide how we do our job. Step away from the car." Darius hesitated. He knew he'd done nothing wrong, but he could see the situation turning dangerous. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Stay calm. Be smart." "All right," Darius said slowly, raising his hand slightly to show he posed no threat. "I'll step back." He took a step away, and as he did, Murphy moved closer, his hand now resting on his weapon. Darius's heart pounded, but he kept his face neutral. He couldn't show them any fear. Without warning, Murphy grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back. The sudden move caught Darius off guard, and he grimaced in pain. Before he could react, Bates joined in, forcing him to the ground. "Hey, what are you doing?" Darius protested, struggling to keep his voice steady, though the pain in his shoulder made it hard. He wasn't resisting, but they were treating him like he was. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Murphy said coldly, tightening the cuffs around Darius's wrists. Darius's mind raced. Resisting arrest? He hadn't resisted anything. He had followed every instruction, tried to reason with them, stayed calm. None of it mattered. They'd made up their minds the moment they saw him. By now, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Across the street, an elderly woman, Mrs. Mildred Walker, looked on in horror from her balcony. Mrs. Walker knew Darius. She had seen him around and knew he wasn't a troublemaker. "What are you doing to him?" she called out, her voice trembling with outrage. "He didn't do anything wrong." A young couple walking their dog also stopped to watch. The man pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is messed up," he muttered to his girlfriend. "They're arresting him for nothing." Darius caught sight of the phone recording, and for a moment he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe the footage would help him later. Maybe it would show people the truth of what happened. But for now, he was powerless. As the officers yanked Darius to his feet, he forced himself to remain calm, to focus. He knew he had to be careful with every word he said next. Anything he said could be used against him. As they led him to the squad car, the crowd grew larger, more people stopping to watch, record, and shout their disapproval at the officers. "This isn't right," someone shouted from across the street. "He didn't do anything." But Murphy and Bates ignored the crowd, their faces set with cold determination. They shoved Darius into the back of the squad car, slamming the door shut behind him. Before they drove off, Darius glanced out the window at the crowd. He could see the concern, anger, and confusion in their faces. Taking a deep breath, he knew he had to say something, even if it was just a few words. "This isn't over," he said loudly. his voice carrying through the thin glass. The words lingered as the car pulled away, leaving the stunned crowd behind. Inside the car, Darius's mind raced with thoughts about what was coming next, how he would fight this, and how he'd make sure justice would be served. Darius's words, "This isn't over," hung in the air as the car pulled away, leaving the stunned crowd in its wake. Seated in the back, Darius's mind raced with thoughts about what might happen next, how he was going to challenge this, and how he would make sure justice was served. The police station, once they arrived, was a world apart from the bustling city streets outside. The cold grey walls, the glaring fluorescent lights, and the steady hum of activity set a stark scene. Officers moved quickly down the halls, some conversing quietly, others intently focused on their work. Though busy, there was a tense vibe in the air. People spoke in low voices, casting cautious glances around. Darius, hands still cuffed behind him, was led through the station's front doors by Murphy and Bates, both keeping their faces unreadable. As they passed through the booking area, a few officers looked up, their eyes narrowing slightly as they noticed Darius. He didn't fit the usual profile they were accustomed to seeing, a well-dressed black man, calm and composed, almost out of place here. "Over here," Murphy barked, steering Darius toward a desk where a worn-out officer sat in front of a computer. The officer looked up briefly, then back down at the screen, barely acknowledging Darius's presence. "Name," he said, his fingers ready over the keyboard. "Darius Grant," Murphy answered before Darius had a chance to. The officer typed it in, his eyes scanning the screen before a slight frown creased his forehead. Without a word, he motioned for Murphy to take Darius to the fingerprinting station. "Let's get this over with," Murphy muttered, nudging Darius forward. Darius didn't resist. He knew not to give them any excuse to escalate things further. As they took his fingerprints, he stayed silent, mind racing, still in disbelief over what was happening. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was being treated like a criminal. But he knew he needed to keep a clear head and stay calm. This wasn't the first time he'd been in a situation like this, and it probably wouldn't be the last. When they finished fingerprinting, Murphy and Bates led him to a cramped holding cell at the back of the station, furnished with only a narrow bench and a metal toilet in the corner. The air was thick with the stench of disinfectant and a sour undertone. They uncuffed him, pushing him inside. "Make yourself comfortable," Bates sneered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You might be here for a while." Darius took a seat on the bench, inhaling deeply. He didn't reply to the taunts. There was no point. He knew they were trying to get a reaction, hoping he'd give them a reason to escalate. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. As Murphy and Bates walked away, they exchanged a knowing glance, an unspoken understanding between them. They felt they'd done their job, locking up what they saw as just another troublemaker, and now they could get back to whatever else came next. But something about this arrest nagged at Murphy, something that left him feeling unsettled. He couldn't place it. But Darius's calm, confident manner didn't match up with the kind of people they usually dealt with. "Thinks he's a lawyer, huh?" Bates scoffed as they returned to the front desk. "Probably just another punk in a fancy suit." "Yeah," Murphy muttered, though his mind was elsewhere. Something about Darius didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He tried to brush the feeling off. It wasn't his concern. They were just doing their jobs, following orders. That was all. Just then, a young officer who'd been watching from the sidelines stepped forward. His name was Officer Parker, and he'd been on the force for only a few months. Eager to prove himself, he was sharp, smarter than most people realized. "Hey, Murphy," Parker called, keeping his voice low. "Can I talk to you for a sec?" Murphy shot him a frown. "What's up?" Parker hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "That guy we just brought in, Darius Grant, I think I know who he is." Murphy's frown deepened. "What do you mean?" Parker leaned in, dropping his voice even lower. "I saw him in an article a few weeks back. He's not just some lawyer. He's a civil rights attorney. A pretty big name, actually. He's been involved in some serious cases, high-profile ones." Murphy's eyes widened a little before he quickly hid his reaction. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Parker replied. "I didn't recognize him right away, but once I heard the name, it all clicked. You might want to tread carefully with this guy. If he's who I think he is, this could backfire on us in a big way." Murphy didn't respond immediately, letting the implications sink in. Parker leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "I saw him in a news article a few weeks ago. He's not just a lawyer, he's a civil rights attorney, a pretty big deal too. He's been involved in some major cases, high-profile stuff." Murphy's eyes widened slightly, but he quickly masked his surprise. "Are you sure?" "Positive," Parker replied. "I didn't recognize him at first, but when I heard the name, it clicked. You might want to be careful with this one. If he's who I think he is, this could blow up in our faces." Murphy didn't answer right away, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He tried to dismiss it. There was no way they'd arrested someone important. They'd done everything by the book, hadn't they? But the doubt gnawed at him. "I'll handle it," he said curtly, brushing Parker off with a wave. Yet, as he walked away, the uneasy feeling settled deeper in his chest. Parker watched Murphy leave, a look of concern on his face. He took out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Taking a deep breath, he dialed, silently hoping he was doing the right thing. The phone rang twice before a rough voice picked up. "Yeah, Captain," Parker said, keeping his voice low. "We have a situation here at the station. I think you need to know about it." Meanwhile, back in the holding cell, Darius sat quietly, focused, and composed. He knew this wasn't just about him. There was something much larger at play. He was certain he had been targeted, though he wasn't sure why. As he waited, he kept his calm, refusing to let any fear take over. He'd been through tough situations before, and he knew he could get through this too. An hour passed before the door to the holding area swung open. A woman entered, carrying herself with an air of authority that instantly commanded respect. She looked to be in her late 30s, with sharp, perceptive eyes. Her name was Lieutenant Karen Mitchell, and she was relatively new to the station, having been transferred from another precinct just a few weeks prior. While she was still settling in, she'd already made it clear that she was someone not to be underestimated. Thompson scanned the room, taking in the scene before her. She noticed Murphy and Bates at the front desk, talking in low voices. Something about their demeanor struck her as off. She had a good sense for reading people, and right now, her instincts were telling her something wasn't adding up. "Murphy, Bates," she called out as she approached them. "What's going on here?" Murphy looked up, clearly surprised to see her. "Nothing much, ma'am. Just another day," he replied casually. Thompson narrowed her eyes. "Really? Because I heard you brought someone in this morning, a man named Darius Grant." Murphy tensed, but quickly regained his composure. "Yes, ma'am. We did." "And what was the charge?" she asked, her tone calm but probing. "Resisting arrest," Murphy answered, his voice steady. "We had reason to believe he was involved in suspicious activity. When we questioned him, he refused to cooperate." Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Did he now?" Murphy nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Thompson didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied Murphy's face, looking for any sign of dishonesty. She'd encountered officers like him before, men who thought they could bend the rules when it suited them. But Thompson was different. She had risen through the ranks by sticking to the rules, and she expected her team to do the same. Finally, she spoke. "Take me to him," she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. Murphy hesitated briefly, then nodded. "Right this way, Ma'am." As they walked towards the holding cells, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than Murphy was letting on. When they reached Darius's cell, she stopped, looking at him through the bars. Darius was seated on the bench, hands folded in his lap, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances. Something about him gave her pause. "This is him?" she asked, turning to Murphy. "Yes, ma'am," Murphy confirmed. "Like I said, he resisted arrest, so we had no choice but to bring him in." Thompson didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened the cell door and stepped inside. Darius looked up, meeting her gaze with calm, steady eyes. He didn't appear intimidated or defiant, just composed. "Mr. Grant," Thompson said, her voice even. "I'm Lieutenant Karen Mitchell. I'm here to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Lieutenant," Darius replied politely. "I'm happy to cooperate." Thompson nodded, appreciating Darius's calm demeanor. "I've been told that you resisted arrest, which led to you being brought in. I'd like to hear your side of the story." Darius held her gaze. "Lieutenant, I did no such thing. I complied with every instruction given by Officers Murphy and Bates. I was simply walking to my car when they stopped me. I asked why I was being detained, and that simple question seemed to escalate things. Before I knew it, I was handcuffed and accused of resisting arrest, even though I followed their orders." Thompson listened intently, her eyes narrowing slightly as she absorbed Darius's words. His tone was calm and measured, yet there was an underlying firmness that hinted he wasn't just someone looking to talk his way out of trouble. She turned to Murphy, who stood a few feet behind her, keeping his expression carefully neutral. "Is that true, Murphy?" Thompson asked, her voice sharp. "Did Mr. Grant comply with your instructions?" Murphy shifted uncomfortably. "Well, ma'am, he questioned us, and things got tense. We had reason to believe he might be hiding something." Thompson's gaze hardened. "And what exactly was that reason?" Murphy hesitated, unable to come up with a convincing answer. "It was just a gut feeling, ma'am." "A gut feeling," Thompson repeated, incredulous. "Is that the basis for your arrest now?" Murphy started to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of the holding area door opening again. All eyes turned as Officer Parker entered, slightly out of breath. He paused when he saw the tense scene in the cell, realizing he'd walked in on something serious. "Lieutenant, I need to speak with you," Parker said quickly, glancing between Darius and Murphy. Thompson gave Murphy one last hard look before stepping out of the cell and closing the door behind her. "What is it, Parker?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Parker glanced around, clearly trying to keep the conversation private. "Ma'am, I've been doing some digging. Darius Grant isn't just any lawyer. He's a prominent civil rights attorney. He's been involved in some big cases, the kind that make headlines. If word gets out that we arrested him without cause, it's going to be a disaster." Thompson felt a chill run through her. She had suspected there was more to this, but learning who Darius was made the situation even more serious. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Positive," Parker replied, showing her his phone with Darius's profile displayed. "This is him. If we don't handle this carefully, we're going to have more than just an internal investigation on our hands." Thompson scanned the page quickly, her eyes widening as she read Darius's background. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a powerhouse in the legal field, someone who had taken on police departments, corporations, and even government agencies. "It doesn't matter," Thompson snapped. "You should have checked everything before you brought him in. Now we have to figure out a way to handle this, and fast." As she spoke, she started to hear raised voices outside the station. Her head shot up and her heart sank as she realized what was happening. The crowd outside was growing, and they were getting louder. She could hear protesters calling for justice and demanding Darius's release. "Great," she muttered under her breath. "Just what we needed." Parker, who had been lingering nearby, stepped forward. "Lieutenant, the community's already riled up about this. We've got activists, local leaders, and even some media showing up. If we don't act soon, this could turn into a major crisis." Thompson knew he was right. She had seen small incidents snowball into something much larger when mishandled. But this was different. This wasn't just about calming a tense crowd. It was about protecting the integrity of the police force and avoiding a potential PR and legal disaster. "We need to get in front of this," Thompson said firmly. "Murphy, Bates, I need a full report on the arrest, detailing every move you made and why. I don't care how late we stay. Get it done. Parker, help me figure out the best approach for the media. We need to control the story before it spirals." As the officers scattered to follow her orders, Thompson felt the pressure weighing on her. She'd only been at the station a few weeks, and already she was dealing with a major crisis. But she wasn't about to let this destroy her career or the department's reputation. In the holding cell, Darius sat, his mind racing as he heard the growing commotion outside. He could hear the crowd's voices growing louder, echoing through the station. He knew his family would be out there, along with community leaders and activists who had always stood by him. They wouldn't let this go unchallenged. A flicker of hope Jenkins in his chest. But he knew it was too early to feel at ease. The police still had control, and they could easily twist the situation to their advantage. He had seen it happen before, and he wouldn't underestimate them now. Back at the front of the station, the tension continued to rise. The crowd had grown to over 100, with signs and banners calling for justice for Darius. Reporters had arrived, cameras trained on the station, capturing the scene. The police station was becoming a focal point, a symbol of the community's rising frustrations. Thompson watched it all unfold from the window, her jaw clenched in frustration. She knew she had to do something, but she was walking a tight line. One wrong move, and everything could explode. But if she did nothing, it could spiral on its own. She turned to Parker, standing beside her, equally tense. "We need to release him," she said finally, her voice tense. "It's the only way to calm this down." Parker nodded in agreement. "But how are we going to explain it to the media? They're not just going to accept it if we let him go without an explanation." Thompson paused, thinking. "We'll call it a misunderstanding. After reviewing the evidence, we'll say there was no basis for the arrest, so we're releasing him. We'll stress that we take these situations seriously and that we're committed to justice and fairness." It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was the best option they had. With any luck, it would ease the crowd and stop things from getting worse. Thompson knew it wouldn't be easy, but she didn't have a choice. She had to consider the bigger picture, the department, her career, and the potential fallout if this wasn't handled right. Thompson turned from the window and headed toward the holding area, determined to defuse the situation before it escalated. As she walked through the station, she passed Murphy and Bates, who were furiously typing their reports. She paused, her gaze hardening. "When this is over, we're going to have a serious talk about what went wrong here," she said coldly. "And trust me, it won't be pretty." Murphy swallowed, nodding silently. He knew he was in deep trouble, but there was nothing he could do now but hope Thompson could clean up the mess. When Thompson reached Darius's cell, she opened the door herself, stepping inside with a calm presence. "Mr. Grant, I've reviewed the situation, and it's clear that there was a misunderstanding. You're free to go. Darius Jenkins slowly, his expression guarded. A misunderstanding, Lieutenant. Is that what we're calling it? Thompson met his gaze without flinching. Yes, and I'm very sorry for what happened here today. It shouldn't have gone this far. Darius studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes searching for any hint of dishonesty. Finally, he nodded. I appreciate your apology, Lieutenant, but you should know that this isn't over. Thompson didn't doubt it for a second. She knew Darius Grant wasn't the type to let something like this slide. But for now, her main focus was getting him out of the station safely and calming the situation outside. She escorted Darius out of the holding area, past officers who avoided his gaze. As they reached the front doors, Thompson took a deep breath. I'll do everything I can to make this right, she said quietly. Darius nodded without a word and stepped outside, where the crowd erupted into cheers at the sight of him. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Darius ignored them, walking straight toward his family and friends. As he embraced his loved ones, Thompson watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable. She knew this was only the beginning. Darius Grant wasn't going to let this go quietly, and the effects of today's events would linger for a long time. For now, though, the immediate crisis was averted. The crowd was dispersing, reporters were packing up, and the tension in the station was finally easing. Thompson knew there was still a long road ahead to repair the damage, but she was ready to face it. As Darius left the station, he knew this was just the start of a new fight. He had been wronged, but he also knew how to turn that wrong into something meaningful. The truth would come out, and when it did, the department and the town would never be the same. The tension in the station was thick, even after Darius walked out the doors. Lieutenant Karen Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Sitting in her office, reviewing the initial reports from Murphy and Bates, Thompson's thoughts kept returning to Darius. Something about the way he had carried himself, calm, composed, almost expecting this, lingered in her mind. She had a strong sense there was more to this story. Thompson had learned to trust her instincts over her years on the force, especially when things didn't add up. Outside her office, the station buzzed with a subdued energy in the wake of the day's events. Officers moved about, avoiding each other's gaze, fully aware they were still walking on eggshells. The crowd outside had mostly dispersed, but the damage was done. Everyone knew this wasn't just going to blow over. Thompson leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The silence in her office stood in stark contrast to her racing mind. She knew she had to dig deeper, to understand who Darius Grant really was, and why his arrest had triggered such a reaction. She couldn't afford to let this go unanswered, both for her own sake and for the department's integrity. Reaching for her computer, she quickly typed in Darius's name to search for more information. The results were eye-opening. Articles, news clips, and interviews all painted a picture of a man who was far more than just a lawyer. Darius Grant was a powerhouse in civil rights, a lawyer who had taken on some of the most powerful entities in the nation, winning cases that made headlines and changed lives. Thompson scrolled through the search results, her eyes narrowing as she read about his latest case, a major lawsuit against a police department in another city. The case had exposed deep-rooted corruption, resulting in several officers being fired and others facing criminal charges. Darius's recent victory had been monumental for him and his team, but it also put him on the radar of law enforcement agencies across the nation. As Thompson dug deeper, she came across a detail that sent a chill down her spine. Darius Grant had been part of a federal investigation into systemic racism within law enforcement. This investigation had led to federal oversight of several police departments, and there were whispers that more departments were under scrutiny. Thompson's heart pounded as she grasped the full implications. She quickly called a contact she trusted at the FBI, someone who could provide information without letting it spiral out of control. The call was brief, but by the time it ended, Thompson's suspicions were confirmed. Darius Grant had been working undercover, collecting evidence for a federal case that could potentially implicate high-ranking officials in her own department. Thompson leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. This was much bigger than she had ever anticipated. Darius hadn't just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had been targeted, and the officers who detained him had unknowingly walked right into a trap. If word of this got out, it would be a scandal of massive proportions. She knew she had to confront Murphy and Bates, but first she needed to gather more information. She spent the next hour piecing together everything she could about Darius's work, his connections, and the ongoing federal investigation. The more she uncovered, the more convinced she became that this was a far more precarious situation than anyone had realized. Finally, Thompson took a deep breath and stood up. She was about to step into a storm, but she had no choice. She couldn't let her department crumble because of someone else's error. Steeling herself, she made her way to the bullpen, preparing for the confrontation that lay ahead. Murphy and Bates were at their desks, going over their reports. They looked up as she approached, sensing the tension in her stance. "Lieutenant," Murphy greeted her, his tone wary. "Is there something you need?" Thompson folded her arms and fixed them with a hard look. "We need to talk, now." The two officers exchanged glances before nodding. They followed her into an empty conference room where she shut the door behind them. The room was sparse, with only a long table and a few chairs, the kind of space where tough conversations took place. Both officers knew this wasn't going to be pleasant. "Lieutenant, what's this about?" Bates asked, trying to sound casual, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. Thompson got straight to the point. "I know who Darius Grant is." Murphy's eyes went wide, and Bates stiffened. Neither said a word, but Thompson saw the flicker of panic in their eyes. They hadn't known who they were dealing with, and now it was coming back to haunt them. "Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've caused?" Thompson asked, her voice low and firm. "Darius Grant is a civil rights attorney and a federal asset. He's been working undercover to collect evidence on police corruption, evidence that could implicate this entire department." Murphy's face turned pale. "We didn't know, Lieutenant. He didn't say anything about being undercover. We thought he was just another—" "Just another what?" Thompson snapped. "Just another black man you could hassle without consequences?" Bates looked down, visibly shaken. Murphy opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Thompson saw the weight of their actions starting to sink in. "You two have put us all at risk," she said icily. "Not just this department, but the whole city. If this investigation blows up, we're all going down with it." Murphy finally found his voice. "Lieutenant, we didn't know. We were just following protocol." Thompson cut him off, her voice rising. "What protocol? You arrested a man without cause. You treated him like a criminal," she continued. "And now we're caught up in a federal investigation that could destroy everything we've worked for. This isn't just about you anymore. This affects the entire department." Bates looked like he might be sick. "What do we do now, Lieutenant?" Before Thompson could respond, the door to the conference room burst open, and Chief of Police Robert Wilson stormed in. His face was flushed with anger, his eyes blazing as he took in the scene. "Lieutenant Thompson!" he barked, his voice booming. "What the hell is going on here?" Thompson straightened, meeting his furious gaze. "Chief, we have a serious issue. Darius Grant is—" "I know exactly who Darius Grant is," Chief Edwards interrupted, his voice dripping with fury. And I know exactly what kind of mess you've made, Thompson. Thompson blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Chief, Save it, Edwards snapped, cutting her off again. Do you have any idea the position you've put this department in? We've got a civil rights attorney working undercover in our city, and you've just handed him all the ammunition he needs to take us down. This is a disaster, and it's on you. Thompson's jaw tightened. With all due respect, Chief, it's not just on me. Officers Murphy and Bates made the arrest without cause, and now we're all facing the consequences. Edward's eyes shifted to Murphy and Bates, his expression hardening. We'll deal with them later. Right now, we need to focus on damage control. Thompson nodded, fighting to keep her composure. I've already started looking into the situation. There's a federal investigation into systemic racism in law enforcement, and it's connected to recent federal oversight of local police. Darius Grant has been gathering evidence for that investigation, and if we don't handle this carefully, it could destroy us. Edward's anger simmered, but he kept it in check. What's our next move? Before Thompson could answer, there was a knock at the door. A young officer poked his head in, looking nervous. Chief, Lieutenant, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent. Edwards frowned. Who is it? The officer swallowed. A federal agent. His name is Williams. The room fell silent as the gravity of those words settled in. Thompson exchanged a tense look with the chief. This was the moment they had been dreading. Send him in, Edwards ordered, his voice tight. The young officer nodded and disappeared. Moments later, the door opened again, and Agent David Collins entered. He was tall, imposing, with a serious expression and a presence that commanded respect. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, and the badge clipped to his belt gleamed under the lights. Chief Edwards, Lieutenant Thompson, Williams greeted, his eyes scanning the room. We need to talk. Edwards squared his shoulders, trying to maintain control. Agent Williams, I'm sure we can explain. Williams held up a hand, silencing him. There's no need for explanations, Chief. I'm fully aware of what's happened here, and let me be clear. This is a very serious matter. Thompson felt her pulse quicken as she watched the agent. There was no mistaking the gravity in his tone. Whatever was about to unfold, it was going to be significant. Darius Grant is a key asset in a federal investigation, Williams continued, his voice measured. An investigation that has been months in the making. His arrest was a mistake that could have significant consequences if not managed carefully. Edwards shifted uneasily. We understand that, Agent Williams. We are prepared to cooperate fully. Good, Williams replied, his tone clipped. Because right now, your cooperation is the only thing keeping this situation from escalating further. Thompson's mind raced as she tried to grasp the full extent of what was unfolding. This was no longer just about Darius Grant. It was about the entire department, the entire city. If they didn't handle things carefully, everything could come crashing down. Williams's gaze hardened as he addressed the room. You will provide him with a formal apology on behalf of the department. Any resistance to these orders will be met with swift and decisive action. Edwards's face turned red with anger, but he nodded stiffly. Understood. Williams turned to Thompson, his expression unreadable. Lieutenant, I expect you to oversee this personally. Make sure there are no further incidents. Thompson nodded, her mouth dry. I'll take care of it. With that, Williams nodded curtly and turned to leave. But before he exited, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. And one more thing, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone. Consider this your warning. The federal government is watching closely. Any further misconduct in this department will not be tolerated. As the door closed behind him, the room fell into stunned silence. Thompson felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, suffocating in its intensity. She knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but she also knew she had no choice but to face it. The atmosphere at the station grew heavier with each passing hour. The events of the morning had set off a chain reaction that no one had anticipated, and now everyone was on edge, waiting to see what would unfold. News of Darius Grant's wrongful arrest spread like wildfire, sparking outrage not just locally, but across the entire city. Protests broke out outside the station, with activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens demanding justice. Inside, Chief Robert Wilson was scrambling to salvage what was left of his reputation. He knew the department was teetering on the edge of a PR disaster, and the only way to prevent it from spiraling further was to make a public apology. Chief Edwards knew deep down that an apology might barely scratch the surface of the resentment simmering for years. Sitting alone in his office, he stared at his phone, his hands shaking as he picked it up to dial the public relations team. He needed a statement, something sincere that could communicate the department's commitment to making this right. But he also realized that no carefully crafted message could erase the damage already done. When his team picked up, Edwards kept his voice steady, saying, "I need a public apology drafted. We're addressing the media outside the station this afternoon." "Understood, Chief. We'll start on it immediately," the PR rep assured him. Edwards hung up and leaned back, running his hand through his graying hair. The weight of his choices bore down on him, years of looking the other way when officers crossed lines, rationalizing it as part of the job or a necessary compromise for the peace. But now, all those compromises were coming home to roost. A knock interrupted his thoughts, and Lieutenant Karen Mitchell appeared in the doorway, her face set with determination. "Chief, Darius Grant is waiting outside with the crowd," she informed him. Edwards forced himself up from his desk. "Good. I'm going out to make the apology." Thompson hesitated before speaking. "Chief, there's something you need to know before you go out there." Edwards raised a brow and Thompson took a steadying breath. "I've uncovered systemic corruption within the department. Bribery, cover-ups, racial profiling. It's not just about Murphy and Bates. This has been happening for years, buried deep." Edwards felt his stomach drop. "Are you certain?" he asked. She nodded firmly. "I've already started gathering evidence. With Darius's cooperation and the federal team's oversight, we can start cleaning up, but it's going to be a massive undertaking." Edwards exhaled, shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. "Then we do what has to be done. It's time to own up." Thompson nodded, respecting his resolve. "I'm behind you, Chief. We need to show the community we're serious about change." Edwards didn't respond verbally, but the look in his eyes reflected his resolve. Together, they walked out of his office, heading to the station's front doors. As they approached, the angry chants of the crowd demanding justice grew louder. Edwards steadied himself, maintaining a neutral expression as he stepped into the sun and toward the waiting podium. The crowd fell silent upon seeing him, cameras flashing, microphones jostling forward. Reporters called out questions, but Edwards ignored them, focusing on the podium and the faces watching him. He caught Darius's eye in the crowd, who stood calm yet resolute, his presence both a reminder and a challenge. Edwards cleared his throat, gripping the microphone. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice even, but weighed down. "I want to begin by acknowledging the events of today. Mr. Darius Grant's arrest was a mistake, one that never should have happened." Edwards paused, feeling the tension rise. "I take full responsibility for what occurred, and I sincerely apologize to Mr. Grant and to the entire community." Murmurs ran through the crowd, a mixture of doubt and anger. Edwards felt the growing pressure as he continued, We recognize that this incident reflects a deeper problem. He swallowed before going on. One that has persisted far too long in our department. Effective immediately, Officers Murphy and Bates are suspended pending an internal review. We are committed to a full investigation of our procedures and practices and will work closely with federal oversight to set a new standard of accountability. The crowd had gone quiet now, listening closely. Yet Edwards could sense the skepticism, their eyes carrying the weight of disappointment and distrust. "I know words alone aren't enough," he added, his voice wavering slightly. "We have much to do to regain your trust, but please know that we are ready to make these changes. We intend to partner with community leaders, activists, and organizations to build a department that serves and protects every citizen equally," he continued, searching for the right closing words. Before he could continue, Darius stepped forward, raising his hand to pause him. "Chief Edwards," Darius said, his voice strong, "I appreciate the apology, but this isn't about words. This is about action. True justice requires more than a public apology. It requires accountability, change, and commitment." Edwards nodded, stepping back, acknowledging that Darius was right. He knew this was just a start, and the hardest work was still to come. Darius turned to address the crowd, drawing everyone's attention. "We've heard apologies before," he began, his voice unwavering, "but now we need a commitment to true, lasting change. We need accountability for those in power and a system that ensures dignity and fairness for all." Applause erupted from the crowd, voices rising in solidarity. Darius's words resonated, striking at the core of the frustration that had been simmering. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Darius continued, his voice clear and strong. "It's about all of us. It's about every individual who's been wronged by a system meant to protect them. It's about making sure no one else endures what I did. Justice shouldn't just be a word. It should be a reality." The crowd cheered as Darius let the moment sink in, feeling the swell of hope. He saw the desire for real change in their faces, a need for something better. "Real change doesn't happen overnight," he continued, "but I believe we can make it happen together, for us and for the generations to come." The applause surged as Darius stepped back, his message resonating with everyone around him. He knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, but he was ready to lead the fight for justice, to demand accountability from those in power, and to ensure that marginalized voices were heard. As he moved through the crowd, embracing supporters and friends, Lieutenant Thompson watched from the station steps. She felt a mixture of relief and determination. Relief that the immediate crisis had been contained, and a resolve to follow through on the changes ahead. She knew there was a long road ahead for the department, but with individuals like Darius Grant leading the charge, she believed they could make it. Thompson turned to Chief Edwards, who remained at the podium, visibly drained, but with a look of steely determination. "We've got a lot of work to do," she said quietly. Edwards nodded, his gaze fixed on the crowd. "Yes, we do, but we'll get through this." As the crowd started to disperse, Thompson noticed a figure standing at the periphery, a tall man in a dark suit, watching Darius with an intense expression. Intrigued, she moved closer to the man. "Can I help you?" she asked. The man turned toward her, his eyes sharp and intense. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Grant," he replied, his voice calm yet serious. "I have a message for him." Thompson frowned, studying the man closely. "Who are you?" The man offered a brief smile, though his eyes remained cold. "Just someone who has a vested interest in seeing justice served." Before Thompson could ask more, the man turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving her with a lingering sense of unease. As the sun dipped lower, casting shadows across the station, Thompson realized that today's events marked only the beginning. The battle for justice was far from over, and the path forward was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope that things might finally begin to change. Across the city, at a small community center, Darius met with leaders and activists, individuals determined to see this change through to the end. The room buzzed with ideas as community leaders debated the best strategies for the newly proposed Community Justice Initiative. "Education is where we need to start," insisted Carmen Diaz, a passionate local teacher. "Real change begins with the youth." Dr. William Walker, a sociology professor, nodded in agreement but added, "Yes, but we also need to address immediate injustices faced by those suffering under a broken system. A comprehensive approach is essential." Darius listened closely, taking in each viewpoint, scribbling notes, and posing insightful questions. He was genuinely moved by the commitment and expertise gathered in that room, realizing this was exactly the type of collaboration he had envisioned, a unified effort built on the strengths of everyone involved. As discussions progressed, actionable plans began to take shape. The group agreed to establish a legal aid clinic offering free representation to those without means. Another initiative was to set up a community oversight board, working hand in hand with the police department's internal affairs to ensure transparency and accountability. Educational programs were next on the agenda. They aimed to implement courses at schools and community centers that would cover topics such as civil rights, civic participation, and conflict resolution. As the meeting drew to a close, everyone felt recharged and focused, knowing they had laid the groundwork for meaningful action. Weeks quickly turned into months, and the community began to notice small yet meaningful transformations. Within the police department, thanks to Lieutenant Thompson and the new oversight board, fresh training programs focused on de-escalation and cultural awareness took shape. Officers like Parker, who had shown a genuine willingness to improve, were given the chance to engage with community leaders and social workers directly. The Unified Justice Initiative also made swift progress, with their legal aid clinic handling numerous cases involving wrongful arrests and police misconduct. Meanwhile, their educational efforts were being piloted in several schools, with the goal of expanding citywide. The most noticeable shift, however, was in the overall atmosphere throughout the city. People were beginning to work together, showing up to address the issues that had plagued their neighborhoods for years. Residents formed watch groups to collaborate with officers to enhance safety, steering clear of discriminatory profiling. Community forums became regular, allowing open dialogues between locals and officials. While progress was steady, it wasn't without challenges. Misconduct incidents still happened, and mistrust occasionally reared its head. Change, as always, moved slowly, and not everyone was on board. But now, there were structures in place to address issues as they aid Jenkins, with a shared commitment to accountability. 6 months after the incident that had sparked it all, Darius found himself back at the police station. But this time he was neither a suspect nor a victim. Instead, he was a partner, invited to speak to new recruits as part of their training, aiming to share his insights and help shape a more thoughtful generation of officers. Walking through the familiar hallways, Darius couldn't help but note the station's new energy. The usual hum of activity remained, but there was now a sense of openness and respect that hadn't been there before. Officers greeted him with respectful nods, some even shaking his hand in acknowledgement. Lieutenant Thompson met him at the door to the training room. "Thanks for coming, Mr. Grant," she said with a warm handshake. I believe your insights will be invaluable for these new officers. Darius smiled, appreciating her sincerity. Glad to be here, and please call me Darius. As they entered, Darius took in the young faces before him, some curious, others slightly apprehensive. He understood their hesitation. He represented a call for change that might feel unsettling, but he also saw potential in their eyes, potential for a genuine shift in how things could be done. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and collected. "My name is Darius Grant, and I'm here to talk about justice. Not just the kind you'll enforce on the streets, but a deeper justice. The kind rooted in respect and dignity for every person you encounter." As he shared his story, speaking on justice beyond badges and laws, Darius could see the young officers listening intently, asking thoughtful questions and engaging in respectful debates. They seemed genuinely invested in understanding how to serve better. After the session, as Darius gathered his things, a young recruit approached him. She was fresh out of training, her face set with determination and a hint of nervousness. "Mr. Grant," she started, her voice wavering slightly. "Thank you for coming. I joined the force to make a difference, but with everything that's happened lately, I was beginning to doubt myself." Darius's smile was warm as he responded, "What's your name?" "Sarah," she replied. "Sarah Johnson." Darius nodded. "Sarah, the department needs people like you, those willing to question, to learn, and to improve. Keep that spirit alive." As Sarah walked away, Darius felt renewed hope. It was young officers like her who would ultimately determine whether the changes they were working toward would truly take hold. Later that evening, Darius sat in his office at the Community Justice Initiative, sifting through case files and reports. The workload was unending, but each small victory, each person helped, made the late nights worthwhile. Just then, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Carmen Diaz, the dedicated teacher who had been pivotal in shaping the education programs. "Darius," she said, her face lit with excitement. "The school board just approved our curriculum for all high schools in the district." Darius stood, beaming. "That's incredible. Maria, your dedication is really paying off." Maria's expression softened. "It's not just me, Darius. This wouldn't be happening without you and everything you've pushed for." Darius shook his head humbly. "I may have been a starting point, but this movement is bigger than any one of us. It's all of us working together to create change." As they discussed the rollout of the curriculum, Darius felt a profound sense of satisfaction. This was real change, not just speeches, but actual progress that would shape future generations. Later that night, as he closed up the office and walked outside, he paused for a moment, letting the quiet city surround him. The streets were settling into the nighttime lull, and Darius reflected on how much had shifted in just 6 months, and how much still remained to be done. Looking up at the stars, he felt a sense of peace and purpose wash over him. The journey was far from over, but they were on the right path. With the community working in unity, he felt optimistic that they could build the kind of place they all aspired to, one where justice was not only preached, but practiced. Renewed, he set off for home, ready to face tomorrow's challenges and opportunities for growth. They were moving forward on the path they had set, even if it wasn't going to be smooth. Darius knew the journey wouldn't be without its hurdles and setbacks, but with everyone pulling together, he felt confident that they could create the community they all envisioned. A place where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a genuine part of everyday life. This was about making sure every person felt respected and valued. Filled with a renewed sense of purpose, Darius began his walk home, feeling both grateful and motivated. Tomorrow was sure to bring new obstacles, but also fresh chances to make a difference, and he was ready to tackle them head-on, step by step. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to my channel. These heartfelt narratives take a lot of time and effort, and having your support truly makes a difference. Thank you for being here and joining me on this journey toward change.